Welcome to the Her Health Podcast, transforming health for women and girls at risk, where we empower women and girls to take charge of their health and well-being. Join us as we shine a spotlight on issues affecting women and girls' health and explore ways to create positive change. Get ready to be inspired and empowered as we discuss health, advocacy, and empowerment for women and girls at risk. Please be advised that this podcast may cover sensitive topics such as gendered violence. We understand that these discussions can be difficult to listen to. If you feel uncomfortable or need support, we encourage you to prioritize your well-being. Consider exploring our other podcasts if these topics are triggering for you. Resources can be found in the description.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Alliance Against Violence in Universities, or AVA's Webinar Series, which we call Webinar Wednesdays because we aim to host a webinar every Wednesday. I'm your host, Dr. Sarah Yursich, with the Alliance Against Violence in Adversity. I am an early career researcher and lead on the webinar series, along with my amazing colleagues, Andrea Dean and Jason Novick, who are here with me today. Outside of my role with AVA, I'm the co-director of the Frida Center for Research on Violence Against Women, housed at Simon Fraser University, and faculty in the Sociology and Criminology Department at Capilano University. Before we begin, just a couple procedural things. This session is being recorded, much like all of our other webinars, so it will be posted to YouTube shortly after it concludes. That means that you can revisit the webinar if there's something you want to see again, or you can share it with friends, family, and colleagues if there's something that you missed. It also means that if there are previous webinars that you didn't see and you'd like to, those are also available for you to see on our YouTube. Now, throughout the presentation, you'll see that the chat function has been minimized where Jason is able to communicate with you to assist with things like tech issues. But if you have questions for the presenters or anything of that nature, please put them in the Q&A function throughout the presentation, and then our speakers will get to those questions at the end when we have more space for dialogue. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that on a national level, we at AVA encourage all Canadians and visitors to Canada to learn about the Indigenous peoples of the land on which they live, work, or visit, and become engaged allies together. We, as Canadians, in the spirit of truth and reconciliation, respect the self-determination of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples, and their rights, responsibilities in culture, languages, and the pursuit of wellness. So, to introduce what you've joined us for today, the title of today's webinar is Sexual Violence and Intimate Partner Violence, Legal Frameworks and Support Strategies. We are joined by Kira Snodgrass and Mary Valenzuela of Calgary Communities Against Sexual Abuse, or CCASA. This is actually our third webinar in a series of 4 webinars in collaboration with CCASA. So if you'd like to learn more from Kiri and Mary, please join us next week. And also please feel free to visit the webinar recordings from the 2 previous weeks. And then by way of quick introduction, Kira, with her background in child and youth care and addictions counseling, has worked on the sexual assault response team in both Lethbridge and Calgary, providing frontline support and education. Her deep passion for supporting people impacted by sexual violence comes through in everything she does. And her co-presenter, Mary, comes with a background in sociology and women's and gender studies. She's dedicated much of her work to creating safe spaces for vulnerable communities. Whether it's immigrant youth or youth in the justice system, Mary has been advocating for change through education and dialogue for years. Kira, Mary, thank you again for joining us. I'm so excited to learn more from you today.
Thank you so much for having us. So as Sarah mentioned, we're going to be talking about intimate partner sexual violence. So what's on our agenda for today is to really kind of review what the laws are around sexual assault specifically, how that comes into play with intimate partner sexual violence, and how those laws have changed over time. We're also going to talk about the dynamics of intimate partner sexual violence, and we're also going to look at kind of doing a bit of an activity as a group just to understand sexual violence within an abusive relationship and how that can show up. We'll also discuss consent in intimate partner relationships, as well as sexual coercion. We'll talk about how to support a disclosure. We'll also review a couple case studies again as a group together, and we'll do another little overview of CCASA services for those who weren't able to join our last couple sessions. Okay, so folks, we have here the sexual assault laws. So I am going to kind of read over them a little bit, and then I'm actually very curious to hear from folks. So if you want to put, I guess, kind of your thoughts of what these laws look like into the Q&A, I can look at those as well. So prior to 1983, sexual assault was defined as a male person commits rape when he has sexual intercourse with a female person who is not his wife without her consent, or with her consent if the consent is extorted by threats or fear of bodily harm, or is obtained by impersonating her husband, or is obtained by false and fraudulent representations as to the nature and quality of the act. I'd love to hear from folks on what your perspective is on this definition. But one thing I will note that I find interesting, I feel like every time I read this over, something new sticks out to me, or something different. This is a very gendered definition. So only a male can commit, and in this specific stance, the term rape is used. We'll talk about that a little bit more. Rape is now not really something that is used in Canada. Folks can use it to kind of express or define their own experience, but it's not something we use as much because rape implies penetration, and we know that sexual assault can occur without penetration occurring. So to kind of be a bit more encompassing, that's why we don't use that term, but it is still very much used in the US. But I also do find it very interesting that it says a male person commits rape when he has sexual intercourse with a female person. So again, gendered. Male could not use sexual assault against a male, or female, anything of the sort. But what I also find interesting with that definition is that it explains it as sexual intercourse, which I do think can be a bit of an invalidating statement because it is not sexual intercourse if it is not consensual. And again, like I said, it's quite interesting that it also notes that he has sexual intercourse with a female person who is not his wife. Meaning, and I think we can probably all assume this from this definition, that if this occurs with him and his wife, then it would not be considered sexual assault, meaning that sexual assault cannot occur in marriage at this point in time. And when it is talking about with her consent, and again, part of this is that it's kind of defining not true consent. So basically, if her consent was given by like it being coerced, extorted by threats or fear of bodily harm. I do find it very interesting that it says obtained by impersonating her husband. Yeah, I'm just curious what led them to include that. But it is very interesting. Again, it does speak a little bit more to the fact that there might not be true consent there, which I will say, based on the time frame, that is interesting, and that is a positive thing that they were able to note, like if she gives her consent under these circumstances, then it's not true consent. But yeah, I do find it very interesting, and I think we can all very much understand that 1983 was not that long ago. So the fact that this was not changed until 1983 is a bit alarming. I'm sure some folks in the audience may have been married prior to 1983, or at least know people who were. And yeah, it's a little bit disturbing that marital rape within Canada was not considered a thing until 1983. But again, we can see how this evolves. In 1983, when the laws did change, it changed to any unwanted sexual act done by one person to another, or sexual activity without one person's consent or voluntary agreement. So what we're seeing in contrast here is already the fact that it's not just about penetration or rape. It is about any unwanted sexual act. And it also does talk about without one person's consent or voluntary agreement. So again, kind of sticking to those same nuances of true consent. It goes on to say the laws relating to the offenses of rape, attempted rape, and indecent assault were expunged from the criminal code and replaced with a trilogy of sexual assault offenses. So there'd be level 1 sexual assault, level 2 sexual assault, which would be with a weapon, threats to a third party, or bodily harm, and then level 3 would be aggravated sexual assault. So what we most commonly see would be what would be classified as level 1. The important thing to note when we are talking about the criminal code is that we're not looking at a hierarchy of impact. We're talking about the degree of physical violence or threats used in the act of sexual assault. So that is important to note, but I'm sure folks notice that this is way more encompassing and way less limited. One thing I will say is that I've had some folks give the feedback that this new definition seems very broad. And sometimes I think when we see a broad definition, we think it's a negative thing, but this could be viewed as a positive thing in the sense that it is kept a bit more broad to encompass all these individualistic experiences that folks have of sexual assault, because it does not always look the same. So it is important that it's a bit more of a nuanced definition. It's a little bit more on the broad side so that it can encompass various experiences that we know folks have. But I do, again, it's not gendered anymore. It does not mention intimate partner sexual violence, but it also doesn't negate that that can happen. It's not saying that someone cannot assault their partner. So we can see that it did change quite a bit. Of course, there are still different areas where we could probably challenge the laws that exist today still on that line, but there was a very, very huge shift, which is really, really great. Unfortunately, it took a long time for that to happen. Like I said, 1983 was not long ago, but it is great that it did shift that much. Now, in 2019, the criminal code was amended to strengthen the legal system's response to intimate partner violence by defining intimate partner for all criminal code purposes and clarifying that the term includes a current or former spouse, common law partner, and dating partner. So this is not just limited to sexual assault or intimate partner sexual violence. It really focuses on any type of intimate partner violence. And by clarifying the definition of that, because I think there was some confusion around former partners, but that clarification does apply to things like domestic violence or intimate partner sexual violence. Okay, and you've already heard me say sexual violence quite a few times. For folks who have joined our previous sessions, the sexual violence umbrella will not be a new concept, but for those of you who are just joining us today, one thing that is just very foundational for our whole discussion, when you hear us talk about sexual violence, it is an umbrella term, meaning that it encompasses any act of sexual violence. So that can include child sexual abuse, sexual assault or rape, sexual harassment, stalking, indecent exposure, degrading sexual imagery, voyeurism, cyber harassment, intimate partner sexual violence, sexual exploitation, or trafficking. So the reason that we use this umbrella term is so that we're kind of able to refer to all acts of sexual violence as opposed to talking very specifically and targeted about certain ones. And one thing I will always note too is that for both degrading sexual imagery and voyeurism, we understand that these can be consensual acts. So when it appears under the sexual violence umbrella, it would be when it is occurring with at least one or more parties not consenting to that interaction. But that is the sexual violence umbrella. So as you hear Mary and I refer to the sexual violence umbrella or just sexual violence as a whole, this is what we're referring to. We're not specifically referring to sexual assault or sexual harassment or child sexual abuse. We are referring to all acts of sexual violence. And Mary, I guess I'll be passing it over to you.
Alrighty, thanks, Kira. So we're now going to kind of switch this conversation to understanding the dynamics of intimate partner sexual violence. And in order for us to do that, we have to understand the dynamics that exist in sexual violence as well as in domestic violence. So starting off with the sexual violence pyramid, similar to the umbrella, if you have joined us in the first two webinars, you might have already seen this umbrella, or not umbrella, sorry, pyramid multiple times. So this will just be a review for folks who are joining us for the first time today. This is what we call the sexual violence pyramid, which really helps us understand why sexual violence still occurs in society and the reasons for sexual violence happening, because sexual violence is something that does not happen overnight. Someone does not automatically just choose to engage in sexual violence when they wake up one day. Sexual violence is something that happens over time. People get exposed to different experiences throughout their lifetime, which eventually influences that choice, that decision to engage in sexual violence. So over the course of their lifetime, they get exposed to experiences which build those attitudes and beliefs that they have. So those attitudes and beliefs that serve as the foundation of our pyramid here are things that influence how we view ourselves, how we view other people, how we treat ourselves, and how we treat other people as well. Unfortunately, these attitudes and beliefs are not always positive, and they can come in the form of discrimination. And that is something that we see with those isms that we are probably aware of. So things like racism, sexism, ageism, classism, ableism, those are discriminatory attitudes and beliefs that are actually systemic, which means that they influence how our society functions. So they do give one group of people in society more power and control over another group of people. So when people who are parts of the dominant group think that they have more power and control over another individual, or they see that person as less than or beneath them, then they might ignore that person's consent or push past that person's boundaries. And that is when sexual violence starts to happen. So when people are acting on those attitudes and beliefs, because now they have internalized it, they now think that they have power and control, and they're above other people, they might verbally express those attitudes and beliefs through sexual violence or sexual harassment. So when people are making comments about someone's body that make them feel unsafe and uncomfortable, or making jokes that are not actually funny but are making people unsafe, that are also sexual in nature, then that is sexual violence happening. Those are verbal expressions and those attitudes and beliefs in action. When people are not being challenged for those, and they think it's okay to keep on engaging in those harmful behaviors, they might engage in physical expressions of sexual violence, like sexual assault or sexual abuse. We also place suicide and homicide at the top of the pyramid because we do believe that those two are the last forms of violence that could potentially result from sexual violence. So if someone takes their own life as a result of experiencing sexual violence, or someone takes another person's life during the process of sexual violence, then those two are the last forms of violence that could potentially happen. But with the pyramid, although it is shaped like a pyramid, it does not show a hierarchy of impact as well. All of these things that you see on our pyramid hold their own impact, hold their own weight. They're all harmful on their own ways. And it's really up to the people who experience sexual violence to make sense of those impacts and that experience. But really what the pyramid shows us is that progression of an individual from having those attitudes and beliefs starting at the very bottom of that pyramid and working their way to the top of the pyramid as they are actively engaging in those harmful behaviors and not acting on those harmful attitudes and beliefs. So the pyramid helps us understand that sexual violence happens not because someone was expressing their extreme desire for another person, or because someone was dressed a certain way, or someone had a drink, or someone was walking alone at night. Those are not reasons for sexual violence to happen, but it is really based on power and control, and someone taking that power and control from another individual. Okay, so that is the sexual violence pyramid. Now, when we are looking at the dynamics of intimate partner sexual violence from the perspective of DV, or domestic violence, we have the power and control wheel to look at. So what this shows us is some of the ways that physical and sexual violence or other types of abuse can occur in relationships. So when we're looking at the power and control wheel, we can see some examples of coercion and threats being used in those relationships, using intimidation. So really engaging in behaviors that might make the other person scared, or using emotional abuse, humiliating them, making them feel bad about themselves, using isolation, removing them from their relationships outside of that intimate relationship, or even minimizing, denying, and blaming them, or using their children in that abusive relationship. And something that is also on the power and control wheel is using male privilege. So a lot of times when we are talking about IPSV, people do not normally talk about male privilege, but it's something that we like to also insert in that conversation, because it is a very important component of intimate partner sexual violence that is not often talked about. Because when we are looking at male privilege or toxic masculinity, it does put an expectation on men to be dominant in their relationships. And that is rooted heavily in our patriarchal society, as well as in those heteronormative values that exist in our society. So when dominance is an expectation in those intimate partner relationships, or intimate relationships, men who deviate away from that dominance or position of dominance are labeled as unmanly or less of a man, right? And so that whole concept basically normalizes the idea that disrespecting your partner, or being dominant over your partner, taking power and control over your partner, is what is considered as manly. Okay? And when we are relating that back to the pyramid that we just talked about, we can really see that in the context of intimate partner sexual violence, those attitudes and beliefs still do exist. And those systemic attitudes and beliefs can still exist, and it will show up in those intimate relationships differently, but there is still that power imbalance there. So if someone who holds more power and control systemically can hold more power and control in that relationship as well. Okay. But when we are looking at where domestic violence and sexual violence intersect, that is where we find intimate partner sexual violence. So we know that domestic violence and sexual violence are both are two distinct things, and they have different characteristics that describe what they are. But where domestic violence and sexual violence overlap is where IPSV, or intimate partner sexual violence, exists. So we can see that those power imbalances that we have seen in sexual violence, and those power imbalances or dynamics of power and control that we see in domestic violence still exist in a relationship. And it can create further imbalances of power. And although that does not mean that the relationship will be automatically abusive if there is an imbalance of power there, it does set up a foundation for abuse to occur if it does actually occur in the future. But looking at our Venn diagram, yes, with intimate partner sexual violence, we know that it is a huge issue, although it's not being talked about a lot, because with numbers, we know that between 14 and 25% of women are sexually assaulted by intimate partners during the relationship. And we also know that between 40 to 45% of women who are in abusive relationships will be sexually assaulted during the course of the relationship, and that could be multiple instances as well. So we really need to talk about this issue more often and shed more light to how much it happens so we can best support the people who disclose that experience to us. Okay. Alrighty, so we're now going to do a little bit of an activity, and we are going to utilize the question and answer, the Q&A feature of this webinar. So when we are thinking about sexual violence intersecting with other forms of abuse, what are some examples of that we could think of? Because sexual abuse is one way that a person may use to gain or maintain their power and control over another person in that relationship. But how might sexual violence show up in or intersect with emotional or verbal abuse, physical abuse, financial or spiritual abuse as well? So I'll give folks about a minute to share what they think of in the Q&A, and we'll look at that. Just thinking of where those types of abuse may overlap. We got from participants saying an abuser forcing their partner to exchange sex for money with the abuser's friends. Yeah, definitely. That could be considered as physical, and it could also be exploitation as well, right? How else might folks or might sexual violence or intersect with other forms of abuse? Or that could also be financial, I guess. Previous example.
I find another common one with financial too is like withholding finances over someone's head. So either saying like, I won't give you money if there's someone who's kind of more in control of finances. I won't give you money, or you won't have access to money unless you do this. Or maybe even using the fact that someone's maybe the primary breadwinner over the head of the other person to kind of have that level of manipulation, or even like use that as guilt to engage in sex or sexual acts. I feel like those can be some common ones with financial as well.
Yeah, 100%. And another common one that we can usually share is just the expectation that a partner will engage in sexual activity if you buy them something,
Yeah.
especially if that something is expensive. So like
Yeah.
fancy dinners, fancy bags or shoes or clothing. But that comes with the expectation that you got to have sex with me after I buy you this.
Yeah, that's so true. And I feel like I've heard that experience from other folks where it feels like an expectation. So if their partner takes them out for dinner or something, like you mentioned, it's like it's an unspoken expectation. And if that expectation is not met, there is it kind of almost goes into that emotional or verbal abuse piece too, where there's a lot of belittling. And I find like emotional and verbal could even look like withholding other forms of intimacy, like emotional intimacy, from someone to try and manipulate them or coerce them into engaging in sex because it's like, well, if you don't give me this, I won't give you that. Or even just like, I would say manipulation and coercion would fall under emotional and verbal abuse anyway. But there can also be physical elements there too. Like, if you don't engage in sex with me, I won't like hug you. I won't give you other forms of physical intimacy. And I think even in terms of physical, there can be, when we look at like threats of violence, that would fall under physical as well.
Yeah.
And I think that can be really tough for people too. And um, when we look at spiritual, I find it really kind of depends on what someone's spiritual beliefs or background
Mhm.
is. But for some people, and Mary, you and I have been able to have some really candid discussions with folks when we've been facilitating where they've shared, like in my culture, my spiritual beliefs, like that background,
Mhm.
it is viewed as like a wife's duty to have sex with her husband. So it's really not about if you want to.
Mhm.
If you don't want to, you have to. Like
Mhm.
it's not, it doesn't really matter what one party wants. It's about there being a level of duty viewed. And we've been able to have some really good candid conversations about that with folks. And that can be a piece that is there as well, regardless of a belief system, regardless of a culture, it could still be viewed as like, as my partner or as my significant other, it's your duty to do this. And even going as far as to say, and if you don't, then I'll seek that outside of this relationship,
Mhm.
which could fall under a few of these categories. I find a lot of these do overlap too.
Yeah, 100%. You nailed that. But I really like how you mentioned expectation, and or our conversation kind of went into expectation from like a small scale
Yeah.
perspective, which is within that relationship, and how it is cultural as well. And we
Hmm.
can see that those expectations really play into how much power and control is embedded within those smaller relationships, as well as those bigger relationships that we have in society. So, really, again, going back to that whole idea that sexual violence is really rooted in power and control, right? Because it can happen just because of those, sorry, not just because, but it can happen because of those expectations that we already have at the back of our heads that are just there sitting, and they come out subtle sometimes, and we don't even recognize them, that, oh, okay, this is already something that I'm not comfortable with, but because you are fulfilling an expectation there. But yeah,
For
awesome.
sure. Yeah.
Thanks, Kara. Alrighty, and thanks for folks who have shared as well. Alrighty, so shifting this conversation back to or not back, but like to sexual consent in committed relationships. So we're just going to talk about how that can look like in committed relationships, or like relationships that have been or are long term. So when we are defining sexual consent in a relationship, there are three aspects that we are usually looking for. So the first one is the feelings, the second is communication, and the third one is perception. So feelings is basically those internal willingness to engage in sexual activity that we feel in that moment. And communication is how we communicate that to our partners. So whether that's verbally or non-verbally, so what are those cues that we are using to communicate that we are willing to engage in sexual activity with them? And the third one is perception, which is how the other person perceives those cues. So whether or not the partner who is communicating those cues would be refusing or willing to engage in sexual activity, that person, the other person, will be perceiving that. And that really depends on how sexual consent was established in that relationship as well. Because sexual consent is also multidimensional, which means that it can evolve through time. So how your relationship or sexual consent in that relationship was perceived, or maybe how you communicate it, it would be different from when you started dating to maybe year 10. Okay. And multidimensional because sexual consent can also change depending on context. People can have different internal feelings depending on the time, the place. So really, it can change depending on the context, no matter how long your relationship is, right, or have been going on. The levels of power and control between partners also plays a really big role when it comes to sexual consent in committed relationships, because there must be equal power between all the people who are involved in that relationship for sexual consent to be there. When there is a power imbalance between the partners, it might be harder for someone to say no to sexual activity, because there might be some fear of retaliation, or there might be a lot of coercion present there, and they might just be really scared to say no sometimes. The relationship length also plays a role. Research shows that longer the relationship, the more accurate partners are able to distinguish those cues or sexual consent in that relationship. But like I said, sexual consent and how you perceive it or how you communicate it can look differently, because it evolves with your relationship as well. So how you do it in your first year can be totally different with how you do it in your fifth year, maybe. Okay. But something to really emphasize is, regardless of how long your relationship is, even if you've been together for 10 years, 20 years, or 50 years even, sexual consent and consent in general is still a huge deal. Okay. Feelings that we're also looking for that are related to internal consent. So when we are giving that consent to sexual activity, we're not only giving that willingness, but we're also looking for that safety piece there. So when we are giving sexual consent, we feel safe, we feel comfortable giving that, we definitely agree, we want to participate in that activity, and we are ready to do that as well. There's also active consent communication when we are looking for sexual consent in committed relationships, which means that we are always actively looking for those nonverbal and verbal cues that indicate whether our partner is agreeing to that sexual activity or not. And some people might argue, well, I didn't hear them say no. Well, when we are looking for consent, we're not necessarily looking for the absence of a no. We're always looking for that ongoing, active, enthusiastic yes. So people might say that, oh, I didn't see it, or I didn't notice it. Well, research, I can't say that word today. Research has shown that people are actually pretty deft communicators when it comes to sex. So we are people who we effectively discern our partner's cues, whether or not they are refusing or willing to engage in sexual activity. Okay. And last but not the least is sexual consent and gender, which means that sexual consent is important in any committed relationship, regardless of the gender of the people involved in that. Okay. But with sexual consent, we also want to talk about how true consent is sometimes do not exist in those relationships. So sexual coercion can happen. And so if someone gives in and says yes to sexual activity, but they don't really want to engage in that, coercion, manipulation was there, and that is not true consent. Okay. So there are 8 basic ways that sexual coercion can happen in intimate relationships, and these are those 8 basic ways. So inducing helplessness and inducing hopelessness are kind of similar in a sense that the person who is not able to say no have already learned from previous experiences that they cannot say no. So inducing helplessness means that this person has already accepted that saying no will not really make sense, because it will always be ignored, and there is a risk that they will be physically overpowered. So they kind of just avoid that at all costs. Inducing hopelessness is knowing and accepting the fact that if they say no to sexual activity, then the consequences for saying no would be worse than actually just complying to sexual activity. So the other person might give them the cold treatment, might be really mean to them, or might even mistreat their children if they have children in that relationship. And they want to avoid that by just agreeing to sexual activity. Physical harm or threats of physical force would be physical ways of overpowering that person or harming them, but are outside of that sexual encounter. So similarly, people have learned that if they submit to sexual activity, then they are lowering the risk of that physical harm happening outside of that sexual activity. Withholding intimacy, we kind of talked about this a while ago, but really kind of a physical or emotional way of coercing someone. So maybe not giving them hugs, or even if someone really likes holding hands, withholding that to get sexual activity in return, or really manipulating them, using their emotions, humiliating them sometimes, or gaslighting them even. Exploitation is when there is deception involved in there. It could, an example would be pretending that they love the person to gain sexual activity from them. It could also be pushing alcohol to lessen their ability to say no in that situation, or exchanging sex for other things, like what we gave you folks as an example for financial abuse. Could also be bullying, so really humiliating them, calling them names, calling them uptight, prude, or all those derogatory terms. Pressure is when someone is begging or nagging the other person, or using really persistence until eventually that person gives in. So this could sound like people saying, "We have had sex before, why won't we do it? Do you not love me anymore?" All those sorts of things. And the last one is relational threats or manipulation. So using the relationship to threaten them. So threatening to end the relationship, or threatening to find sexual activity from outside of the relationship, or even calling their partner as a bad lover or a bad boyfriend, girlfriend, whatever. But those are ways that sexual coercion can show up in intimate relationships. And those are ways that true consent might, or sorry, consent that is not true consent might exist in those relationships, which result to intimate partner sexual violence. But yeah. Alrighty, I'm going to pass it on to Kira to start us off with supporting and disclosures.
Thanks, Mary. So a very common question that we like to explore is why someone might feel hesitant to talk about sexual violence that they're experiencing in a relationship. And there can be an overlap with why someone might not disclose domestic violence that they're experiencing in a relationship. And I think that it's important for us to note that there's a lot of different reasons that can go behind this. And so it's important, again, that we're not approaching it with like a one size fits all. Oh, this must be why. But there can be a variety of reasons. They can be financially dependent on the individual. They don't want to lose that person. Also, maybe the relationship outside of the sexual violence piece, maybe they're happy in the relationship outside of that, right? And they might not want to lose that person. And part of that too is once you share that, I'm sure we've all probably had loved ones in our lives that have shared something about their partner, and it changes our view a little bit. It might make us feel frustrated with that person, might make us not really like them that much, and someone might just not want that upset in their relationship. Another piece could be that they don't recognize that what they are experiencing is sexual violence. Again, with some of what Mary was talking about with in the last slide there, a lot of folks might not know that like coercion and everything like that could equate that it's actually sexual violence. Because I think there can also be confusion when there is a level of consensual sexual intimacy in a relationship, but then there's also a level of sexual violence. I feel like for some folks that can create a bit of confusion for themselves too. So there's definitely a lot of reasons, but we're going to play a video here that will speak to a disclosure of intimate partner sexual violence. And we'll talk about it a little bit. So pay attention to some themes of why she maybe hasn't talked about it before or isn't really looking to talk about it much further outside of this.
Excuse me if I seem like I'm on the defensive, but I am. This feels like a necessary evil. I find it hard to talk about any of this with you. My sister is clinically depressed too, and watching her get chewed up by the system makes it harder for me to be here. It's been going on for years, most of my marriage. I thought it was normal. He's always been aggressive, and I guess his sex drive is stronger than mine. Probably has something to do with my depression. I'm just realizing now that me and my friends were joking around about our husbands and how things weren't the same as when we were young, our sex lives. And one of them said how she practically had to beg her husband for it. I thought it was funny and said I had to beg mine to stop. But if I wasn't in the mood, he would just keep badgering me, saying things like, why are you so frigid? I'm your husband. You should be giving it to me. Other times, he would just take it by force. Well, there was this long, awkward silence. Suddenly, I knew how wrong it was. We have a good life. 2 beautiful kids. He's a great father. And he just got promoted. I'd hate for him to lose his rank over this. But now that my eyes are open,
Okay, folks, I know that's a bit of a heavy video, but what we see with Paulette is there's a lot of different dimensions that her husband uses to exert intimate partner sexual violence in their relationship. So from like manipulation and that kind of thing, coercion, to even just having that force against her. And not even using some of those tactics to try and get her to engage. So it's quite multifaceted with her experience, and you can note that she didn't really, I think she kind of knew that, this isn't really okay, not something I'm very comfortable with, but she didn't truly realize the gravity of it until she's speaking with her friends and seeing their reaction. And what I think is interesting too is, I'm sure on some level everyone can relate to this. Sometimes I think we don't actually recognize the severity of a situation, or maybe how wrong something is, or even just the full context until we're maybe speaking to someone else. I think our minds will do some weird things to try and justify things or minimize things to kind of keep our emotional safety intact. But then sometimes even just verbalizing something to someone else, it's like, oh yeah, like that is a little bit odd, or that is a bit messed up, or maybe I did overreact to this or underreact to this, or maybe I didn't realize the true severity of this, right? And that's just so true of a lot of different situations. And so we can see that that realization was very, very difficult for her. So we'll open it up again to our lovely audience. What do you notice Paulette focusing on, or what is she concerned with when she discloses? Someone shared his identity and society's perception of it. Yeah, for sure. She's very concerned about that. And I think she mentions in like the rank of his job, he just got a promotion and she's not wanting this to impact that. What else did we notice about what her focus is?
I think there was also a level of fear there, and like disclosing, because she mentioned something about her sister, being, I guess, not being treated well by the system. And maybe there is some level of fear of experiencing the same thing that her sister did, which kind of stops her from disclosing her experience. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. And I think another thing she had mentioned too is that he's a good father. Um and like they have two wonderful kids, and she doesn't want her kids to lose their dad or to maybe even have a changed perception of their dad. Um I'm sure that's something that would be going on in her mind too. And I agree, Mary, there was a couple things she said that kind of implied fear of how she'd be received. And I can't help, this might be me reading between the lines a bit, but I can't help but think that um, when she's talking about his job and his rank and the fact that he got a promotion, I also can't help but think if maybe there's a level of fear there, because it does sound like, he has a good position, maybe an influential position, and there might be fear around that. Because for some reason, think in a societal perspective, I think if we think of someone who would use intimate partner sexual violence to cause harm to their partner, we would think that they're just like not a good person at all, that they wouldn't be a good parent, they wouldn't be a good employee or employer, anything of the sort. But the thing is that two things can exist at once, right? Someone can use sexual violence to cause harm, but still be viewed as a good dad, still be viewed as a good employee, right? The things aren't mutually exclusive, and I do think that is an important thing to note as well. Thanks, Mary, and thank you to those who answered. And I'm curious again, what do we think that Paulette maybe needs to hear in this moment when we're thinking about how we could best respond to her? Someone shared validation for sure. I think, yeah, I really agree with that. I really feel like being able to validate her feelings and say, like, even, yeah, it makes sense that you feel conflicted. It makes sense that you're holding space for the fact that he's a good dad and you care about the way that he's viewed in the community and the way that that impacts you, and you can do all that. Someone shared that she is not alone for sure. Avoid painting a terrible picture of the husband would just make her feel shame. Definitely. And that's the thing. And I think we mentioned this in one of our sessions, just as we were talking about sexual violence as a whole. It is typically done by someone who is known to the individual, and there's typically a relationship there, and it's confusing and it's conflicting. There might be love and trust in that relationship, but harm is being done too. And when we are, if we were to just say, yeah, your husband sucks, he's awful, he's harming you, he's a bad guy, he's what it would do is create a barrier of support and kind of impact that ability to give her appropriate support because she would be defensive, right? That's also her children's father that we're talking about, and she maybe still has loving feelings for him. So, yeah, I think that also kind of summarizes what we would maybe say to support her is, you're not alone. Your feelings are normal, your feelings are valid. And that also does lead us into our key messages of support. For folks who have joined previous sessions with us, these are not new, but let's talk about these as it relates to Paulette specifically and how we can apply them to other folks who disclose intimate partner sexual violence. So for Paulette, I believe you. And what we have always said with these key messages is they're really kind of the groundwork for how we support. They're the inspiration for how we support. They don't need to be said verbatim. Paulette might know from our body language and the fact that we're saying, I'm really sorry this is happening, that we do believe her, right? And we can highlight that it's not her fault. Especially because there's a level of coercion and manipulation that she shared that goes on where she's almost feeling bad about not wanting to engage in sexual acts with her husband. So then he essentially bullies her and coerces her, manipulates her into that. And we can remind her that is not your fault. He is doing that. That is not your fault. If you are not wanting to be intimate at the moment, that is okay. You do not need to do that. It is not your fault. And also saying her needs come first. She's very concerned about his view in the community, in his work, and that kind of thing. And just highlighting for her that her needs do come first. And one thing I will say is that when we share with her that her needs might come first, she might decide that what she needs is to stay with him. and to maybe at this time not address what is going on. And while that might be something that we're like, no, Paulette, like we don't want you to have to continue to endure this. If that is what she needs at this time, then that is what she needs, and we can support that. Because again, like I said, we can create a barrier to support if we're instead telling her, no, you need to leave him right now. You need to do this, this, and this. Like I said, we can validate and prioritize her needs and what that looks like. We can also normalize her feelings. Someone said that too. You're not alone. And well, what is occurring is not normal and shouldn't be normalized. Her feelings are normal for an abnormal situation. What she's feeling makes complete sense and it's valid. And I support your decisions. This kind of goes into what I said about her choosing to stay with him, choosing to work through it, or choosing to potentially leave. She can know that we have her support. Maybe in our heads, we would do something different in a situation. Maybe we secretly wish she would do something different than what she's choosing. But we can just support her in that. And she can know that she can always come back to us and seek further support if she ever decides she would like to do something else. And that is the important thing, is really prioritizing her and her needs, and keeping that bond of the relationship from her disclosing at first, right? Because that's a very tough and vulnerable thing to do. And it's important that she knows that she can come back to us as needed for further support. All right, Mary, I'll let you talk a little bit about CASA.
Alrighty. Okay, so we are nearing the end of this workshop, and we're just going to talk about what we do at CASA. And again, for folks who have joined us for the first two sessions, again, some review for you. For folks who are joining us for the first time, these are what we offer to the community. So CASA, which stands for, again, Calgary Communities Against Sexual Abuse, is the main service and education provider for sexual violence in Calgary and surrounding areas. And we do have a variety of clinical services for folks who have experienced sexual violence, and some education for folks who would like to learn more about sexual violence. So for our clinical services, we do have, or support services, we do have, the first one on there is the police and court support, or what we commonly call a PACES program. So PACES is the team at CASA who provides support for folks who are navigating the legal system, whether that person has already reported or is just thinking about reporting. It is a service available for anyone who is 12 years or older. Actually, all of our services, with the exception of the education and training, is for folks 12 years or older. So for PACES, they are not lawyers. They would not give legal advice, but they do provide extra advocacy for folks who are in the legal system. So they can provide court tours. They can be there through their reporting process. They can connect them to the victim assistance support dogs from the Calgary Police Service, and be there throughout the trial. So really providing extra support and care to individuals who are in the legal system. We also provide counseling for folks. We have up to 24 free and confidential sessions for folks who have experienced any type of sexual violence, whether recent or historic. We also offer up to 6 sessions for support people. So anyone who is providing that care and support to an individual receiving counseling, or someone who may be present, who was present during a CSART CSART session, and we'll talk about that in the next bit here. And we can offer counseling individually or for group counseling, and we can offer them through Zoom, through phone calls, or in person. We also have our sexual assault response team, or what we commonly call as CSART. And this is a team composed of female identifying doctors, nurses, and CASA staff that provide support to anyone who has experienced sexual assault in the last 7 days. So the main access point for CSART is the Sheldon Schumer Urgent Care Center in downtown, but this team can also be mobile. They can go to any emergency departments across the city. And when they are accessing the support, they are given their options moving forward. So the first option is to get that medical attention and that emotional support from doctors, nurses, and CASA staff. So that can include treatment for any injuries or STI or pregnancy treatment prevention, and with the sexual assault response team, the second option is anything from option 1, plus the addition of a sexual assault evidence kit being collected and reporting in that moment, so police will be involved. And the third option, which we call the third option, is everything from option 2, but with just a slight change that they're not reporting right there in that moment, but they actually have a full year to decide whether reporting is what's best for them in their healing journey or not. That kit will be kept for 1 full year, and folks are able to just call the support and information line if they would like to start the reporting process. The sexual assault response team at Sheldon Schumer is for folks who are 14 and above. And for anyone under the age of 14, they would have to access it at the Alberta Children's Hospital, but really anyone below the age of 18 can still access that from the Alberta Children's Hospital. We also have our support and information line, which is available from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. every single day of the year, even on holidays. And the support and information line is available to virtually anyone, really. If someone is needing that support after experiencing sexual violence, looking for grounding techniques or strategies and resources moving forward, they can call the line. For folks who are supporting another individual, they can call the line to get resources, or even just get that support for themselves as well, because it can be really an emotional process when we are receiving a disclosure, and it can be really impactful. So we do encourage supporters to also call the support and information line, maybe to debrief or just talk about what impacts they have felt after supporting someone. And it is also available to professionals who have more specific questions around sexual violence or would like to do consultations with the team for a client as well. We also support the Alberta One line, which is with the Association of Alberta Sexual Assault Services. And they do have a chat and text feature. So for folks who are not too comfortable talking to someone on the phone, they can get that support there. And that is also available from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. every single day. We also have, that should be integrated, but we also have the integrated case management, which is for folks who are not yet ready for counseling, but are also have complex needs, and they also have experienced sexual violence in the past. With our education and training programs, we do have really anything for all ages. We have our workplace training, professional and public workshops, which is what Kira and I usually do. So we go out to communities, we do workshops and trainings with professionals or other organizations to really spread awareness and education around sexual violence. And we also have our children and youth programming team. So they go to schools and they start as early as preschool all the way to high school to provide that education. We have our Who Do You Tell program for preschool and elementary schools, which start a conversation on body autonomy, about consent, safe touches, safe people, all that stuff. And with high school and junior high, we have our Birch Grove program, which kind of dives into sexual violence and how to best support their peers if they do disclose an experience. Our volunteer engagement, really amazing program. We have our volunteers who help us out all throughout the year, supporting our support and information line, as well as other events outside of CASA. But, with referral process to CASA's clinical services, we do self-referral. So we do encourage clients to call the support and information line to book an intake assessment. One of our intake workers will call the individual accessing that service, and then that intake assessment will determine whether they are a fit for CASA and if they are able to start that clinical service as a result of that. We also offer consultation with professional support. So if there is, like I said, anyone who is needing services for a client or have very specific questions about a client's experience, they can call the support and information line and ask for a counseling supervisor to provide more information on very specific questions around an experience. And we ensure client safety and stabilization. So before, during that intake assessment process, folks are assessed whether they are a fit for CCASA and whether they are ready to get into counseling or other forms of therapy, because that is also a really long process. And so just really assessing whether they are ready for that or not. And we do have that integrated case management program that is for folks who have those complex needs going on in that moment. But if you do have questions about CCASA services, we do encourage you to call the support and information line to get more specific answers if you do have more specific questions. I want to say thank you for being here with us today. So those are the contact informations. The support and information line is that one, and the Alberta One line for sexual violence with a call and text feature is the second number on your screen. The 24-hour sexual violence support line is another line available for folks. It is not affiliated with CCASA or ASAS, but it is a really good resource for folks that is available 24/7.
Thanks for joining us on the Her Health podcast, transforming health for women and girls at risk. Remember, your health matters, and together we can make a difference. Until next time, remember to prioritize your health and well-being. For more resources and support on issues affecting girls, women, and gender-diverse people, visit our website at avatraining.ca. This is Dr. Nicole Letourneau. Thank you for listening.